We've drawn down completely from one war. We're in the process of drawing down from another. For there to be no spending cuts associated with that would seem to be quite odd, actually. I mean, you don't have the same level of deployments going on, you don't have the same level. So, and the question then becomes, well, where are you cutting? And I think you would just hope that as they get to this, automatic cuts, that should be concerning to people, because you'd really want to go in and make sure what you get rid of in the military budget, in the defense budget, is stuff that, one, does not in any way make us more vulnerable in a substantive way. You don't cut things that we need to be safe, which is obvious. There's going to be a lot of debate around that, but I think we can try. And also, does not cut veterans' benefits in any way, because that's another thing that some Democrats, they tiptoe around that sometimes, like they're daring there to be somebody talking about that. Veterans' benefits should stay what they are, and that's where I think I see it. It has to be very careful what you're cutting.
So let's transition to talking about national security now, Buck, and you presented the question, where are you cutting? Well, 414 congressmen asked that question as well today. There was a vote in the House of Representatives to ask President Obama to define exactly where the cuts, not just Defense Department, but also discretionary spending as well, would come from. Because right now it exists in this sort of bland world of 10% mandatory on defense, 8% mandatory on discretionary. So the vote in the House was 414 to 12. I'm sorry, 414 to 2.
Right.
To 2. Yeah, bipartisan.
Yeah.
To make President Obama explain exactly where these cuts would come from, because
sequestration was going to actually go down.
Because we don't know the answer to your question. Where would these cuts
come
from?
The devil is in the details here. That's the simple way of making the point.
The best we can do is that Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta has said the following. We have this quote, that it would come from and it would impose upon the U.S. ground force would be the smallest since the 1940s. The Navy would shrink to the size it was at the beginning of World War I, and the Department of Defense civilian workforce would be the smallest in history. While we don't know exactly where those cuts might come from, that's the suggestion from the Secretary of Defense.
Well, Panetta suggested months ago that this was designed to be a disaster, because it was designed, this whole idea was designed to keep Congress from even approaching this, to take it very seriously. So he's sort of assuring us this will be a disaster. But the White House and OMB have been incredibly tight-lipped about how this would all happen. The OMB director, as much as wrote in a Politico article, we have not discussed how sequestration is going to go down. It was never meant to actually be implemented.
It's a political football, isn't it? The Democrats are including us in there. They're including us in there.
Leadership? Where is leadership?
The White House
Ultimately, it does come down to the president.
In a political year, the White House is not going to want to give a laundry list of all of the ways that it's going to make people mad of what it's going to cut. But what I don't understand about this as a political matter, this was a deal that Republicans struck with Democrats. And from the very beginning, it was supposed to be a way of sort of keeping each other honest and holding each other hostage to doing something about the fiscal cliff. I never understood why Republicans agreed to the $500 billion in defense cuts as if Democrats don't like cutting defense. As if this would be so painful, Democrats would get on board with extending the Bush tax cuts. So as a political matter, I think we're seeing that maybe this strategy was sort of flawed from the start.
I think some of them thought they could compromise the issue and maybe make it more strategic and not just an across-the-board cut wherever you want, but let's sit down and have a conversation about if there's excess, what we can do here. I mean, I think that this area needs to be subject to cuts, but as we were saying, you've got to be strategic about it. If there's one area in the country where you want to be sure that what you're cutting needs to be cut, and you're not just randomly saying, let's cut this, let's cut that, it's defense, especially with the way national security looks right now.
Well, House Republicans may be proven right just yet. There are still months to go before we reach the fiscal cliff, and their strategy, if it was one, to force specifics at some point and therefore kind of avoid the cuts once the specifics are put forward, might still play out.
Well, it was to rope Democrats and say, if we go over this cliff, we're going over together, and you're going to have to take responsibility for $500 billion in defense cuts if you don't go along with doing something about extending the Bush tax cuts.
You have to link it to the economic argument, I think, to make people across the board really understand what's at stake. I think it's going to anger people. That quote that you gave here about the ground force shrinking, the Navy shrinking, that's all very scary to people, but I think what's scarier is more job loss at this point right now.
Do you really?
That really hits home. Yeah, I do. I think economy hits people in a way that national security doesn't. I think everyone can live and breathe.
Well, let me just respond to this real quick. Isn't this supposed to hurt? I mean, eventually cuts have to happen, and cuts are going to be painful. Cuts are not supposed to be fun. Austerity is not a big party. So at some point, there's going to be job losses. There's going to be less government spending, or else we just keep marching towards insolvency as a nation.
You might be right, Jedediah, but I have to say the Secretary of Defense did say this as well. He said, unfortunately, while large cuts are being imposed, the threats to national security would not be reduced. As a result, we would have to formulate a new security strategy that accepted substantial risk of not meeting our defense needs, we'd have to re-examine our ability to address our threats.
I mean,